Welcome. I hope you're blessed in the Lord today. In this video, we want to ask the question, is the law of Moses divided up into moral, civil, and ceremonial laws? I ask this because as we're looking at the law of Moses, one of the things that comes up is covenant theology. Covenant theology looks at the Old Testament law in particular and says that the moral laws of the Old Testament that are in the law of Moses are still in effect, whereas the ceremonial and the civil aspects of the law are not in effect. So, to some degree, this is true because we can look at the Bible and we recognize that there was a universal law that was given before the law of Moses. Those in Noah's day were judged because of their violence. Those in Sodom and Gomorrah for their immorality. We look at Cain that was being judged for his murder. And so we see that there is a standard of righteousness that God has that has always been known to mankind. It says even in Romans chapter 1, verse 18, that though they knew the righteous requirements of God, though they knew what God required of them, the Gentiles who were idolaters didn't practice them. And so we're able to see even after the law of Moses was given, that God judged nations like Babylon or Persia. He would judge them because of their wickedness. But he didn't ever judge them because they didn't keep the Sabbath or they didn't come for the feast of Passover to Jerusalem. He didn't judge them for disobeying the laws of Moses, but he judged them for that universal law which we could say is a moral law. But we want to ask the question, does the law of Moses tell us that what is written in the law, in the Old Testament, is separated out, that there's a distinction between moral, civil, and ceremonial? Because the way that covenant theology works is it wants to put us under part of the law, but actually we are not under any part of the law of Moses. So let's go ahead and look and see if it is divided up. Before we get into that, let's look at 1 Corinthians chapter 9, starting in verse 20. I want us to see that there is a different law that we are under. We are under the law of Christ. We're not under the law of Moses. We're not under the old covenant law that was written and engraved on stone. In 2 Corinthians 3, it tells us that. But that's passed away, and now we're under the law of the Spirit in Jesus Christ, which is summed up in loving God and loving your neighbor. So let's see here. Paul mentions this in 1 Corinthians 9, verse 20. To the Jews I became as a Jew, that I might win the Jews, and to those who are under the law as under the law, that I might win those who are under the law. So Paul's saying, if you look at the context of chapter 9 and chapter 10, it's talking about the food laws in particular. So he's saying, when I'm among the Jews, I eat kosher food. I don't eat things that are forbidden, but I want to have a good audience with the Jews, and so I obey the laws of Moses, even though I myself am not under the law of Moses. Verse 21, he says this, to those who are outside the law, that is the Gentiles, as outside the law. In other words, when I'm among the Gentiles, I act like I'm not under the law of Moses. But he goes on and makes it clear. He doesn't want to say he's lawless. He's still under a law. He goes on, being not without God's law, but under Christ's law, that I might win those who are outside the law. So he doesn't go to the Gentiles and insist, hey, don't eat pork around me. No, he'll eat pork with them because he wants to have an audience with the Gentiles as well. And so he will accept whatever customs come his way, and he will disregard the law of Moses, but he won't disregard the law of God, which is the law of Christ. And so let's go ahead and look at some passages. We just want to run through some passages in Exodus. And we want to ask the question, in the law itself, does it tell us that there's distinctions in the law? We looked a couple videos ago and we saw that the law of Moses, the old covenant law, was given as a constitution or as a national law for the people of Israel that were living in the promised land. And they were told to keep that law, and it was a contract between them and God. It was a covenant. And so God promised to give them certain things, certain blessings, if they would obey the law. But if they didn't keep the commands that he gave, then he would curse them and kick them out of the land, or he would curse the land itself so that it wouldn't bear fruit. And we see this many times throughout the Old Testament history. But we want to ask the question, is the law separated into moral, civil, and ceremonial? Is this something that the law tells us? Or is it one whole law, one constitution, one covenant that you take all of it or you take none of it? Let's see what it says here. So first of all, we see in Exodus chapter 19 that God calls the people of Israel to gather around the Mount Sinai, that he's going to speak to them. And then he speaks to them in Exodus chapter 20, verses 1 through 17. He speaks to them and he gives them the 10 Commandments. They hear his voice and they hear the 10 Commandments spoken. Then in verse 18, it says this, "Now all the people witnessed the thunderings, the lightning flashes, the sound of the trumpet, and the mountain smoking. When the people saw it, they trembled and stood afar off. Then they said to Moses, 'You speak with us, and we will hear. But let not God speak with us, lest we die.' And Moses said to the people, 'Do not fear, for God has come to test you, and that his fear may be before you, so that you may not sin.' So the people stood afar off, but Moses drew near the thick darkness where God was." So, I want us to see a couple things. One is that when God spoke to them directly, the 10 Commandments, then they were afraid, and so they asked that Moses could go to God and get the words from God, and then Moses would speak to them because they didn't want to hear his voice anymore. They were frightened. God accepted this arrangement. Moses accepted this arrangement, and later we will see the people accepted this arrangement and received the words from God through Moses. So I just want to give us a hint here that the 10 Commandments are not distinct from the rest of the law. It's all incorporated into this one law. But we'll get to that maybe in the next video. Let's go on to see here in verse 22. Same chapter, verse 20, Exodus 20, verse 22. "Then the Lord said to Moses, 'Thus you shall say to the children of Israel, you have seen that I have talked with you from heaven. You shall not make anything with me, gods of gold or silver. You shall not make for yourselves. An altar of earth shall you make for me, and you shall sacrifice on it burnt offerings and your peace offerings, your sheep and your oxen. In every place where I record my name, I will come to you, and I will bless you.'" So here we have Moses is continuing. He hears from God. This is Moses hearing from God, and he hears more information about the command to have no other God beside me and to not make any graven images, no idols. So he continues to talk about idolatry. So he's continuing to talk about the same thing. Then in verse 23, he goes on, or verse 24, he talks about what kind of altar that they should make whenever they're going to sacrifice to the Lord. So he begins to talk about ceremonial offerings right after talking about the sin of idolatry, which was one of the 10 Commandments. So again, we see there's a blur. Ceremonial, moral. If we count the 10 Commandments as summing up the moral law, then it's blurred together. We even see, of course, the ceremonial law was mixed in with the 10 Commandments itself with the 4th commandment, but we'll get to that later in the Sabbath. Let's see here. So if we go on, verse 24, "An altar of earth shall you make for me, and you shall sacrifice on it burnt offerings and your peace offerings, your sheep and your oxen. In every place where I record my name, I will come to you and will bless you. And if you make me an altar of stone, you shall not build on it of hewn stone. For if you use your tool on it, you have profaned it. Nor shall you go up my steps by my altar, that your nakedness may not be exposed." So he's still talking about idolatry, but now he's talking about some details about it, about how to not hewn any stone, just to make sure that you're not making any idols. So he's basically reiterating the 2nd commandment of forbidding idolatry. Exodus chapter 21, this is a whole section all the way through chapter 23, where he's talking about God's giving the law to Israel through Moses. Verse 14, chapter 21. "But if a man acts with premeditation against his neighbor, to kill him by treachery, and you shall take him from my altar, that he may die. And he who strikes his father or mother shall surely be put to death." So in verse 14 and 15, we see now he's reiterating the command, do not commit murder. So he's still talking about moral aspects, even though he's talking now not from the 10 Commandments. And he says, if you dishonor your parents by striking them, you shall be put to death. That was also one of the 10 Commandments. So he's still talking about moral issues if we call the 10 Commandments the moral law. Jumping up to verse 33 in chapter 21. "And if a man opens a pit, or if a man digs a pit and does not cover it, and an ox or a donkey falls in it, the owner of the pit shall make it good. He shall give money to the owner, but the dead animal shall be his." So now we've moved in the same list of laws, talking about moral things that are related to the 10 Commandments. Now he shifts over and he's talking about more civil matters, about negligence and harming somebody else's property because of your own negligence, and what that you're going to have to pay a fine if that happens. And so he's mixing the things together. We see that he doesn't break it off and say, I'm talking about the moral law in the 10 Commandments. Now I'm going to shift and talk about ceremonial law, and now I'm going to shift and talk about civil law. Instead, what we see is that it's all mixed together because it's all one law. It's all the law of God that was given to Israel. It's part of the covenant, the old covenant. If we skip over to Exodus 22, starting in verse 29, "You shall not delay to offer the first of your ripe produce and your juices. The firstborn of your sons you shall give to me. Likewise, you shall do with your oxen and your sheep. It shall be with its mother 7 days. On the 8th day you shall give it to me. And you shall be holy men to me. You shall not eat meat torn by beasts in the field. You shall throw it to the dogs. So now he's talking about you can't eat roadkill. You can't eat something that you find dead because you're set apart as holy to me. So this holiness has to do with the food laws, but it's in the list that also includes moral aspects of the law. He's also talking about the ceremony of giving the first fruits, and even offering our children to God, and even offering our animals unto the Lord. So he's talking about ceremonial law of Israel. This is all one law. There is no division between the different kinds of laws. Yes, of course, if we go to the law in America, we can see legal, we can see civil, we can see all that, but it's all part of the law of the United States. And so in the same way, when we come to the law of Moses, which is the law of God given through Moses, and we see this is the old covenant that was made with the nation of Israel, it is one holistic law. Now jumping to Exodus chapter 23, starting in verse 6. You shall not pervert the judgment of your poor in his dispute. So now it's going to talk about the judicial law. Keep yourself far from a false matter. Do not kill the innocent and righteous, for I will not justify the wicked. And you shall take no bribe, for a bribe blinds the discerning and perverts the words of the righteous. Also, you shall not oppress a stranger, for you shall know the heart of a stranger, because you were strangers in the land of Egypt. So he's talking about how to deal with foreigners. He's talking about how to deal out justice in the judicial system. Verse 10, just going right along, he goes on to this. Verse 10, 6 years you shall sow your land and gather its produce, but the 7th year you shall let it rest and lie fallow, that the poor of your people may eat, and what they leave the beast of the field may eat. In like manner you shall do with your vineyard and your olive grove. So now he's talking about part of the law that's dealing with how you deal with agriculture. But this is part of the covenant that God made with Israel that they were commanded to keep. Then he goes on, verse 12, 6 days you shall do your work, and on the 7th day you shall rest, that your ox and your donkey may rest, and the son of your female servant and the stranger may be refreshed. So now he goes back and talking about the Sabbath, which he started talking about already back in chapter 20. This is already chapter 23. So what I want us to see is that the law of God given through Moses, the law of Moses, which is the old covenant, was one unified law. It was a holistic law. This is why I mentioned, I think in the last video, that unless you are in the land of Israel with the temple there, you can't practice the law of Moses. And right now, even in modern Israel, they can't practice the law of Moses because the temple is not built. And besides, they have a secular government that doesn't let them stone the adulterer and stone the murderer and stone the rebellious son at the gate. And so we see that the law, if you're going to keep it, it has to be one holistic law. It was a covenant made with a nation. So there has to be a nation. It has to be in the land because it was related to the land of Palestine. If they're not in the land, then God can't bless the land. We can't apply this and say, if we keep certain laws of God, then God will bless the nation of America. That doesn't apply to America. This was a law that was given for the nation of Israel in the land of Israel for a particular time. And it was a holistic law, not one that was divided up, as some theological systems would have us believe. If we go to chapter 24, Exodus 24, verse 3, we see this. So Moses came to the people, and told the people all the words of the law and all the judgments, and all the people answered with one voice and said, all the words which the Lord has said we will do. This is the law of God. This law that was given to Israel was the law of God for Israel. It's not just the law of Moses. We call it the law of Moses because it came through Moses, but it is the law of God. It came from God. And so we see that God gave them his laws for that nation through Moses. We also see that it's one holistic law. It's not divided up into different things. It's not, even though there's religious and moral and civil and ceremonial aspects that are all woven together, we can see the distinction of them, but actually it is one law. So as I mentioned before, it's true that there is a distinction in the nature of the universal law that God has had from the beginning, and he will have always, which is the law of Christ, to love God and to love your neighbor. It's summed up in love your neighbor as yourself. This law has always been in force. This is why when Cain killed his brother, he was guilty. When the Sodomites were immoral, they were guilty. Whenever the people of Noah's day were violent, they were guilty because they were not obeying this universal law. The Babylonians were guilty of it. the Assyrians were guilty of it. All were guilty of this law, but this was distinct from the law, the code that was given to Moses that was for the people of Israel. So I hope we can see that there is, in one sense, we can say there's a distinction between mercy and sacrifice. Jesus made it clear that I desire mercy, not sacrifice. So we see that there is a clear division, that the law of Christ is higher than any ceremonial laws of the Old Testament. But we can't make it into a system and say that that's exactly how God has written it down, that we are supposed to keep now only the moral laws of the Old Testament, but the rest of them we disregard. No, we are either under the law of Moses in every aspect of it, or we are not under the law of Moses. So I want us to be clear about this, and we'll go on to ask the question, well, if we're not under any of the law of Moses, then does that mean we can kill? Can we murder? Can we do? No, because there is still the law of Christ. As Paul said, what we looked at at the beginning, that to those who are outside, we are not under the law, but not without God's law, but under Christ's law, which is by the power of the Holy Spirit and which is summed up in loving God and loving your neighbor. And we'll get into that in later videos. I hope this has been helpful to you. God bless.